There is a number in your head right now, a dollar amount, a weight, a job title, a relationship milestone that you have quietly decided must be reached before you're allowed to feel okay. And the darkest part of that belief isn't that the number is too high. It's that you will hit it, and something inside you will already be calculating the next one before the feeling of arrival has even had time to land. Think about the last time you achieved something you had wanted for years. Not something small, something you had genuinely built your hopes around. A raise, a degree, a number on a scale you'd been chasing for a decade. Try to remember, honestly, how long the satisfaction actually lasted. Not the congratulations, not the announcement, the private, internal feeling of having arrived. For most people, if they're honest, it measures in days, sometimes hours. And almost immediately afterward, a quiet, familiar voice returns with a new condition attached, as if the goal itself had been nothing more than a temporary disguise for an appetite that was never going to be satisfied by reaching it. Most people believe they are waiting for specific circumstances to improve before they can finally feel settled. More money, more certainty, more stability, more proof. But there is a far more disturbing possibility hiding underneath that belief, one most people never examine closely enough to notice. The condition was never really the obstacle. The waiting was the condition. And no external circumstance, no matter how favorable, was ever going to be the thing that ended it. This is where the trap begins to reveal something most self-help content gets completely wrong. Picture a couple who have decided they'll have a baby once they're financially stable. A reasonable, responsible sounding plan. But watch what actually happens to the definition of stability over the years that follow. At 28, stability meant a certain income. By the time that income arrives, stability has quietly redefined itself to include a bigger emergency fund, a better neighborhood, more job security in an uncertain economy. 10 years pass. The income they once thought would feel like enough now feels, somehow, like the bare minimum. Nothing about their actual financial position failed them. Their definition of enough simply moved every time they got close enough to touch it. This is where psychology becomes uncomfortable, because it means most people aren't actually failing to meet their own conditions. They are unconsciously constructing conditions specifically designed to remain slightly out of reach. Neuroscience offers a precise mechanism for why this happens. Rooted in a process called allostasis, the way the brain and body constantly recalibrate their sense of normal based on current circumstances, rather than holding a fixed baseline. When your income rises, your nervous system doesn't file that improvement away as a permanent gain. It quietly resets its reference point, and the new income becomes the new normal, invisible, no longer registering as progress at all. This is why lottery winners, famously studied by psychologists, tend to return to roughly their prior levels of life satisfaction within about a year of winning, not because the money didn't help, but because the nervous system absorbed the change and moved its baseline to match it, leaving the underlying hunger for more exactly as unsatisfied as it was before the money arrived. Your brain isn't broken when this happens. It's functioning exactly as evolution designed it to function, a system built to keep detecting deficits so that you never become dangerously complacent in an environment where complacency once meant death. Watch closely, because this is the part almost nobody notices. The goalpost isn't being moved by bad luck, or unrealistic ambition, or a culture obsessed with more. It's being moved by a survival mechanism that cannot register safety for long. because organisms that stopped scanning for threats and stopped striving for advantage were throughout most of evolutionary history. The ones that didn't pass on their genes. There's a cognitive bias that compounds this effect. One researchers call adaptation level theory. The brain doesn't judge circumstances against some fixed objective standard. It judges them against whatever it has most recently experienced. This is why a raise that would have felt enormous 5 years ago can feel almost invisible once your reference point has quietly shifted upward to match it, and why a temporary setback that would have felt minor a decade ago can feel catastrophic once comfort has become the new baseline. The mind isn't measuring your life against some stable line labeled enough. It's measuring it against a constantly moving average of your recent past, which means the finish line was never fixed in the first place. It was always going to travel with you, restocked by every improvement you made toward it. But something even more dangerous is happening beneath the surface of this pattern, and it has to do with what waiting for the right conditions is quietly training your mind to believe about happiness itself. Alfred Adler described a particular kind of psychological error he saw again and again in his patients, the belief that fulfillment exists on the far side of achievement, permanently deferred until enough external proof of worth has accumulated. Adler called the underlying feeling driving this an inferiority complex, though the term has been diluted by popular use into something much smaller than what he meant. He wasn't describing simple low self-esteem. He was describing a foundational sense that one's current self is not yet sufficient, not yet earning the right to feel at peace, which drives an endless compensatory search for external conditions that might finally silence it. The tragedy, Adler observed, is that this search cannot succeed because the conditions were never the actual source of the deficiency. They were symptoms of it, chased as though they were the cure. That's the part almost nobody says out loud. If the sense of not enough yet originates internally, no external achievement can permanently resolve it, because the achievement is being evaluated by the very same internal mechanism that generated the deficiency in the first place. You cannot out-earn, out-achieve, or outperform a belief system. You can only starve it of the evidence it survives on, which requires noticing it directly rather than continuing to negotiate with it. Think about the last time you assumed a certain achievement would finally make you feel different about yourself, not just externally successful, but internally different, calmer, more deserving of rest. And think about how quickly that feeling, if it arrived at all, dissolved back into the same baseline unease you started with. That dissolution isn't evidence that you chose the wrong goal. It's evidence that the goal was never capable of doing the psychological work you were quietly asking it to do. This is where behavioral psychology adds a particularly unsettling layer through something researchers call the arrival fallacy, the deeply held, almost universal belief that reaching a particular achievement will produce a lasting change in how we feel, when in reality, it typically produces only a brief spike followed by a swift return to baseline. What makes the arrival fallacy so persistent is that it survives every single disconfirmation. You reach the goal, the promised transformation fails to materialize, and rather than questioning the premise that achievement produces lasting fulfillment, the mind simply concludes that this particular goal wasn't big enough and quietly selects a larger one. The fallacy doesn't get corrected by experience. It gets fed by it. And once you see that clearly, a much more unsettling question emerges. If no condition has ever actually delivered the peace you attach to it, what made you certain the next one will be any different? Cognitive science offers a related distortion that deepens this picture further. Known as hindsight-proof optimism, the tendency to remember our past predictions as far more accurate than they actually were. Ask someone whether their last major achievement delivered the lasting change they expected, and many will insist, somewhat defensively, that it did, even while their current behavior chasing the next condition with identical urgency quietly contradicts that claim. The mind doesn't like to admit that a belief it acted on for years turned out to be false, so it revises the memory of the belief itself rather than confronting the pattern directly. This is part of why the arrival fallacy survives so many rounds of disconfirming evidence. The evidence isn't ignored. It's subtly rewritten into something that looks, in retrospect, like confirmation instead. Carl Jung approached a version of this same trap from a different angle entirely, one concerned less with achievement and more with identity. Jung believed that many people spend the majority of their lives building and defending a persona, a curated, socially acceptable self, constructed to earn approval and avoid rejection, while the deeper, more authentic self underneath remains unexamined and unlived. Waiting for external conditions to improve before beginning to live authentically, Jung would argue, is often a sophisticated way of protecting the persona a little longer, because authenticity requires facing parts of yourself that the persona was specifically built to conceal. As long as some external condition remains unmet, you have a legitimate sounding reason to postpone that confrontation indefinitely. The condition isn't really blocking your fulfillment, it's providing cover for an avoidance that has very little to do with money, timing, or circumstance at all. This is where the pattern becomes genuinely difficult to interrupt through willpower alone. Because willpower operates on the level of behavior, while this mechanism operates on the level of unconscious self-protection. You cannot discipline your way out of a defense mechanism you haven't yet identified as one. Viktor Frankl's writing on meaning offers one of the sharpest correctives to this entire trap, because his central claim inverts the logic almost everyone operates on by default. Frankl argued that meaning is not a byproduct of favorable circumstances, it is something available, without exception, in any circumstance, including the most horrific ones imaginable, because meaning is generated by the stance a person takes toward their situation, not by the situation itself. This has a direct and uncomfortable implication for anyone waiting for conditions to improve before allowing themselves to feel that their life counts. If meaning were genuinely contingent on circumstance, the people enduring the worst circumstances in human history would have had the least access to it. Frankl's observation was the opposite. Meaning was accessible precisely because it never depended on conditions being favorable to begin with. That single inversion is where this entire trap loses its foundation, because it means the wait was never a rational strategy misapplied. It was a fundamental misunderstanding of where fulfillment actually originates, placed, mistakenly, in the external world, rather than in the internal orientation a person brings to whatever world they're currently standing in. The Stoics reached strikingly similar conclusions, working from an entirely different set of assumptions 2,000 years earlier. Seneca observed that no external circumstance has ever been sufficient on its own to produce lasting contentment, because contentment is a disposition, cultivated internally, not a prize awarded by favorable events. He warned specifically against what he called living provisionally organizing your entire existence around a future condition, only to discover, once that condition finally arrives, that you have simply relocated the same waiting posture onto a new target. Marcus Aurelius, writing to himself in the middle of a military campaign, returned repeatedly to the idea that circumstances themselves are neutral, and that suffering arises not from conditions, but from the judgments we layer on top of them, meaning the endless pursuit of better conditions, is, in a very real sense, chasing a solution to a problem that was never actually located outside the mind to begin with. Epictetus made the distinction almost mathematically precise. External conditions belong to a category entirely outside your control, and building your peace of mind on top of that category guarantees instability, because you have staked your well-being on something that was never yours to secure. None of these thinkers were being cold or dismissive of real material hardship. They were identifying a specific psychological error, the belief that internal peace is downstream of external arrangement that persists across every era and every economic condition, because it is not produced by scarcity or abundance. It is produced by where a person has been taught, often without realizing it, to locate the source of their own well-being. There's a final piece worth naming, one that behavioral economists have documented across dozens of countries and income levels, past a fairly modest threshold of covering basic needs and a reasonable margin of security. Additional income shows a strikingly weak relationship to reported life satisfaction, while the belief that more income would meaningfully improve life satisfaction remains. Almost universal, regardless of how much a person already earns. The gap between those two findings is not a minor statistical curiosity. It is the entire trap, laid out in numbers, a near universal certainty that the next condition will finally be enough, sitting directly beside overwhelming evidence that it consistently isn't. Here is where the deeper layer of this trap surfaces, and it's the layer almost nobody talks about. The habit of waiting for conditions to improve doesn't just delay satisfaction. Over enough years, it becomes the primary psychological structure a person lives inside an identity built entirely around approach, around striving toward a horizon that recedes at exactly the rate it's approached. And this structure is stable precisely because it never resolves. A person whose sense of self depends on the pursuit of better conditions has, without realizing it, built an identity that requires the goal to remain permanently out of reach, because reaching it would remove the very framework their sense of purpose has been organized around. This is why so many people, after finally achieving the condition they spent decades chasing, report a disorienting emptiness rather than triumph. It isn't ingratitude, it's the sudden, unfamiliar absence of the structure that had been quietly organizing their entire identity, the striving itself, now with nowhere left to go. At least until the mind manufactures a new deficit to replace the one it just resolved. There's a particular kind of grief hidden inside this emptiness that rarely gets named for what it is. When the pursuit ends, the person is often left facing, for the first time in years, the very self they had been quietly avoiding through motion, no longer distracted by the next milestone, no longer able to explain their dissatisfaction as a temporary condition of not yet arriving. This confrontation is uncomfortable enough that many people respond to it by manufacturing a new pursuit almost immediately, sometimes within weeks of achieving the old one, simply to avoid sitting inside the silence that success unexpectedly produced. The goalpost doesn't just move because the brain resets its baseline. It moves because stillness, for a mind that has organized its entire identity around approach, can feel more threatening than the chase ever did. So what actually interrupts a pattern this deeply structural? Not the achievement of better conditions, since better conditions have already been tested repeatedly and have never once produced the lasting resolution they were expected to deliver. What interrupts it is a much smaller, much less glamorous shift, learning to notice, specifically and in real time, when the mind is substituting a future condition for a present choice and asking, plainly, whether that condition is actually necessary for the thing you claim to want, or whether it has simply become the place where wanting itself is safely allowed to live without ever being tested against reality. Jung would call this withdrawing a projection. Frankl would call it locating meaning inside what is already available. The Stoics would call it, correctly, sorting what belongs to you from what doesn't. In every framework, the underlying move is identical, bringing the pursuit back down from an imagined horizon and into the only place it was ever actually possible to live. The present, unglamorous, entirely available now. Most people never make that shift until circumstances force it, an illness that finally proves conditions can never be perfectly controlled. A loss that reveals how much time was spent waiting for a future that has now been permanently foreclosed. The tragedy in these cases isn't that the conditions were never met. Often, by then, most of them were. The tragedy is that meeting them changed almost nothing, because the entire premise had been wrong from the very beginning, the belief that peace was something circumstances could eventually hand over, rather than something available, imperfectly and unglamorously, the entire time. There is a quiet kind of relief hidden inside this recognition, even though it doesn't feel like relief the moment you first see it clearly. If peace was never actually located in the next condition, then you are not behind. You have not been failing to catch up to some external standard that everyone else seems to be reaching faster than you. The standard itself was never real in the way it presented itself. It was a moving reflection of your own nervous system's inability to sit still in safety, projected outward and mistaken for a fact about the world. Once that becomes visible, the chase doesn't have to end abruptly or dramatically. It simply stops being mistaken for the source of the very thing it was always promising and never delivering. So here's the question worth sitting with long after this video ends. If you reached every condition you are currently waiting for, the income, the security, the certainty, the readiness, and discovered, as every honest study of human satisfaction suggests you likely would, that the peace you were chasing still hadn't arrived, what exactly would you have to conclude about where it was hiding all along? If this kind of psychology, the kind that changes how you actually relate to your own expectations, not just how you think about them, is something you want more of, consider subscribing, only if it genuinely resonated with you. There's more waiting beneath the surface.